Hello, my name is Brittany Keese, and today I'm going to be discussing cognitive load theory and the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, and how to reduce those extraneous loads. First, I want to talk about cognitive load. Cognitive load theory analyzes cognitive processes as well as the instructional design principles and how they work and interact with each other. So cognitive load theory is centered on biologically secondary knowledge and how one acquires such knowledge. Biologically secondary knowledge refers to knowledge that has not been acquired as a result of evolution or survival or innate skills, but as a result of a cultural push, resulting in the creation of schools and other education facilities, with secondary knowledge as the forefront of to be obtained. There are 5 basic principles that are used when we're describing information processing characteristics of cognitive load. The first being information store principle, then the next being borrowing and reorganizing principle, randomness is genesis principle, narrow limits of change principle, and the 5th and final environmental organizing and linking principle. The first principle, information store principle, is concerned with long-term memory. So long-term memory evolves and has been learned for the sake of adaptation to different environments. Learning itself has adapted over a long period of time and has synthesized with old material to give it new meaning. Students continue to expand learning concepts throughout their educational lives. The next principle I want to talk about is borrowing and organizing principle. It hinges on the idea of borrowing information from other people or obtaining it through our ancestors or by means of imitation, and then storytelling advice. So this often becomes a process of borrowing and combining new knowledge, which is acquired by a first-person encounter, to create new knowledge to set in long-term memory. The best way for students to learn is from other people, bouncing ideas off each other and sharing their prior knowledge. The third principle is randomness as genesis. Randomness as genesis principle states that biologically secondary information is created and therefore adapted based on a series of trial and error, and randomness as genesis is tested for effectiveness. A student having no primary background on a subject and not also receiving instruction will try different methods to solve a problem and then determine if those methods are effective or what they need to change. The fourth principle is the narrow limits of change principle. And this examines more of the working memory than the long-term memory that was previously analyzed. And the working memory has 2 primary limitations. The first is capacity and the second is duration. So the capacity of the working memory is typically 7 elements of information and between 2 to 4 processes. And the duration of the working memory is 20 seconds on average. So the working memory must adapt and evolve due to those limitations. And alterations to secondary information may be detrimental if the changes are too big or too large, but rather small, manageable changes will have a better result in ensuring functionality. So this is important to be mindful of when we're creating instruction for our students. The last principle is environmental organizing and linking principle. And this principle hinges on the processing system in which information is held in the memory system. And it's used to interact with the external environment and create appropriate action. So this principle provides the context for linking long-term memory, working memory, and an event to an action deemed appropriate for the environment. So large amounts of information can be useful when stored and organized effectively. When getting students' attention in class, I use a whole brain approach in which students react to an indicator I present to them. Throughout class, they must respond with that indicator appropriately when asked. There are 3 types of cognitive load which can result from acquisition, storage, and use of biologically secondary information. The first type is intrinsic. So intrinsic is interactive relationships between instructional elements that are meant to be learned simultaneously and create a strain on the cognitive load. So intrinsic cognitive load can only be adjusted by increasing the knowledge base. On the other hand, you have extrinsic, which refers to the high interactivity due to the material creating an excess variable of elements in the instruction. And extrinsic can be altered by changing the delivery of the instructional method by means of a less straining presentation of the material. Lastly is germane, which is considered effective, which is the working memory is used to deal with the intrinsic cognitive load creating a synthesis of the two types of cognitive load. So germane is kind of what happens as a result of the intrinsic and the extrinsic. So what is left over is the germane. There are three assumptions of cognitive load theory of multimedia learning. There is dual channel assumption, limited capacity, and active processing. And dual channel assumption refers to visual and auditory processing separately from one another. Limited capacity states that humans are limited to the amount of information that can be processed at one time by multiple channels. And then active processing says that active learning students attend to relevant incoming information simultaneously, organizing and integrating knowledge appropriately. There are 5 processes in the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. We have selecting words, selecting images, organizing words, organizing images, and integrating. So selecting words must make relevant connections to avoid overloading the cognitive system. So you want to avoid and select relevant words to use in your presentation. Selecting images, you also want to make visual representations for those words that create a memory in your working memory. It creates a visual. And then organizing words that were selected as relevant to the message, they need to be organized to create a coherent representation. Just like with selecting images, they need to be organized to create a coherent representation. And then lastly, interpreting word-based and picture-based representations may be the most important step, in which the pictorial representation and the selected words create connections and really create a coherent representation of both. The 5 processes of the cognitive theory of multimedia learning are certainly one of the most meaningful pieces of the theory. And when creating a presentation for students, it's important to not overload the channels of processing with excess amounts of words and pictures. So creating short presentations with concise and relevant pictures and no more than 1 or 2 per topic should be a good idea. And the presentation should also be arranged in a way that is cohesive and forms connections between material that's being learned. Cognitive theory of multimedia learning has evolved into what it is today by means of research and predecessing flowcharts, and the underlying common theme that says consistent and true to this day is the concept of multiple channels processing multimedia learning. So those channels have been expanded on and narrowed into the 5 processes outlined today, and it's just continuing to be built on. So the future of cognitive theory of multimedia is unknown. However, it's suggested that the next step may be in examining motivation and metacognition and cognitive processing engagement factors. Next, we're going to look at some principles for reducing extraneous cognitive processes in multimedia learning. So the principles that I'm going to be looking at today are redundancy principle, signaling principle, and temporal contiguity principle. And just a couple of things to keep in mind is with extraneous cognitive load, we have multiple channels processing within the working memory, and we have a limited capacity as well as an active processing range. So we really need to be mindful of those things when we're creating lessons for our students. So let's review some principles to help reduce that extraneous cognitive load. The first principle I want to talk about is the redundancy principle, and there are a couple different types of redundancy principle ideas. So we have picture text, equipment, written and spoken text, and then second language. And the 2 that we're going to see most often are picture text and written and spoken. So we're going to talk about those mainly. So picture text is when we might have a picture on screen with text. Now, we could probably interpret one without the other. So the picture has maybe some labels or it's pointing to something that's relevant, but then the text is also saying the exact same thing that the picture's saying. We don't want our students processing that at the same time. One or the other would be just fine. We're being redundant when we have 2 things that have the exact same information being displayed. And then written and spoken spoken text is basically when we have written words up on the screen, which is wonderful, but then we're also speaking the words, and now they might not be exactly the same. So my students are taking in what is being written, but they're also trying to listen to me for their auditory signal, and it might be disconnected. They're not exactly word for word, so now they're trying to process 2 different channels at the same time, auditory and visual, and it's really interfering with their cognitive processes. So we would much rather have the essential information displayed to get across these points. So maybe instead we might have just words displayed and we have them read it, or I just have a relevant picture and then I'm going to be speaking what I want them to understand. So those are some ideas how to get around redundancy principle. And next I'm going to show you an example. Here's a slide I might use when I'm teaching my students how to change a mixed number to an improper fraction. And you can see that I have the written directions and I have the picture. So let's act as if you were my class. So the first thing you want to do when we're changing a mixed number to an improper fraction is you want to multiply the denominator by the whole number. So 5 times 2 is going to give me 10, and then I'm going to add that number, which was 10, to my numerator, which is now 3, to get 13. So that will be the new numerator for my improper fraction. And then I'm going to keep the denominator the same. So I just got 13, and I keep it over 5. So 13, and then in my fraction bar, 5. So as you can see, that was kind of hard because I have my directions listed on the board. So you want to read the directions instead of listening to me. But they're not lining up. My words are not lining up with the words on screen. So let's see how this should look. So as you can see, I have a picture. So I'm going to explain how to change a mixed number to an improper fraction. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to multiply the denominator by the whole number. So 5 times 2 is going to give me 10. And then I'm going to add 10 to my numerator, which is 3. So 10 plus 3 is going to give me 13. And I'm going to change, and then I'm going to leave my denominator the same. So my new fraction is 13/5. So you can see how that was much easier to follow what I was trying to say instead of having directions and explaining at the same time. So you just want to be mindful for your students that you're not being redundant while you're giving directions. The second principle I wanted to talk about today was signaling principle. And signaling is really just adding a cue that directs the learner to the essential information by way of an arrow or a visual cue. So it's really to help reduce that extraneous load with the presentation so that they're focusing on the essential information that we want them to learn. So for example, when I'm having my students identify parts of a fraction or a mixed number, I would present them with this picture, and then I might show them the arrow pointing to the whole number and showing it to the denominator and to the numerator. So rather than me referring to those things and them trying to figure out what number I'm talking about, now that arrow is directing them exactly to what I'm referring to when we're talking about parts of a mixed number. So it really helps reduce that extraneous load, and kids are not worried about, well, what is she talking about when she's talking about the denominator? Well, she's talking about the 5. So you can see how that helps reduce that extraneous cognitive load. The third and final principle I'm going to be talking about today is temporal contiguity principle. And this is really trying to create less of a strain on the working memory so that they don't have to hold any information in the working memory and process something new at the same time. So, for example, this slide right here, you can see that I have the directions that would be spoken verbally while having a picture on screen. And that would be the best way to reduce temporal contiguity because now they're not holding the picture or the directions in their memory and trying to work out the problem. So let me show you an example of what would not work. Alright, so here's the problem that we're going to be doing today, class. And we're going to be changing a mixed number to an improper fraction. So let's look at the steps on how to do that. Alright, so in our first step, we're going to multiply the denominator by the whole number, and then we're going to add that number to our numerator, and then we're going to have that will be our new numerator in our improper fraction, and then we're going to keep the denominator the same. Alright, so let's go ahead and do that for the previous mixed number that was displayed. So you can see that was kind of hard. Students are now having to remember, well, what fraction, what mixed number did she have on the board before she gave me these directions? I don't remember. So maybe instead I have the directions and then I have the picture. So I just gave the directions and now here's the mixed number that we're going to change into an improper fraction. Well, that also is making them hold the directions in their memory. So let's try it like this. 2 3/5 is our mixed number that we're going to be changing into our improper fraction. So the first thing that you guys want to do is you want to multiply the denominator by the whole number. So 5 times 2 is going to give you 10. And then you're going to take that number 10 and you're going to add it to your numerator, which is 3. So 10 plus 3 is going to give me 13. 13 is going to be your new numerator for your improper fraction, and you're going to keep the denominator the same as it was in the mixed number. So you're going to have 5 for the denominator. So your new improper fraction is going to be 13/5. You can see that was a lot easier, me giving verbal directions to them while they see the problem on the screen. A lot easier than trying to remember what mixed number I wanted them to change or the directions that I gave to them. So the final thing I want to talk about today is refutation text. And the main components of refutation text are you have an assumed fact that is a misconception, you have refutation of that misconception by a student, and then third you have that explanation of the concept and the acceptance of the accuracy. So let me give you an example. So within my field, teaching math, we do order of operations. So I would give this to my students on the board, and I'd say, 2 students evaluated this expression, and they got different answers. So neither of them made a computational mistake. They didn't mess up adding 3 plus 5. So how did this happen? Well, most students at this age either have learned order of operations or they haven't. So we come in and most of them are thinking, well, you can work it out any way you want. Whichever is easiest you can do first. Or they'll say, no, you have to work a problem out left to right, no matter what. And then I come in and say, well, actually, there's an order of operations that you have to do. You have to do the parentheses first if there are any. Then you have to do the exponents. Then multiply and divide from left to right, and then add and subtract from left to right. And that's typically where they get the idea of left to right, but they forget that there is actually an order. So, for example, in this problem, my students might do, instead of starting with multiplication or division, they might go left to right. So they might say, well, 15 plus 12 is 27, and 27 divided by 3 is 9, and 9 plus 5 is 14. So one student gets 14 because they say, oh, left to right's fine, because that's what I think I should do. And then I've got my other student that says, well, I want to do the easiest stuff first, so I'm going to do 3 plus 5 and get 8, and I'm going to do 15 plus 12 and get 27, so I'm going to have 27 divided by 8. But I can't do that, so I'm going to leave it as 27 divided by 8. And then I come in and say, well, actually, there's an order of operations that you're supposed to do, and you have to start with parentheses. If there are none, you go to exponents. If there are none, you go to multiplication or division from left to right. So they look at this problem and they say, okay, I see division, there is no multiplication, so I need to do 12 divided by 3, which is 4. And then, okay, so this now it is 4. So really my problem says 15 plus 4 plus 5. And then, all right, we are done with multiply and divide. Do we have any addition or subtraction? And they say, oh, well, now we have two addition problems. All right, which one do you do first? This is where the left to right comes in, and sometimes they don't remember this. So left to right, so 15 plus 4 is going to give you, what? 19. And then 19 plus 5 is going to give you 24. 24 is our answer. Well, how did you get 14 and, what was it, 27 divided by 8? How can there be that many answers? And well, I tell them there are not that many answers. There really only is one answer, and we need to know the order of operations to be able to do that. So this is the point in time where all the students are like, oh, I guess there is only one answer to a math problem typically. So for me, telling them to do the order of operations are like, why do we need to learn the order of operations? Well, we need to learn the order of operations so that we don't have 3 different answers for the same problem. That's why mathematicians came up with the order of operations. And that's when we really get the acceptance of this concept that we really do need to have the order of operations so we only have one answer. I hope this video was very informational for you and that you were able to follow along. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me or to comment on this video, and I would be more than happy to help you or share any thoughts with you. Have a wonderful day.